welcome everyone. So we're going to be talking about sex. I'm not going to do much of the talking. It's not something I know that much about. But thankfully, we have experts on the panel. We have Nana and Abosede. So like everyone else before me, we'll dive right into it. The question before us is, does Africa do we need a sexual revolution? So I guess before we get to that, I'll ask you, Nana, in answering that question, what do you see as, what is a sexual revolution to you? And then do we need one? And then I'll ask the same of you as well.
Okay. So for me, a revolution implies a 360-degree turn. It means a complete change. It means breaking down what already is and rebuilding anew and rebuilding better. And so do we need to have better sex? Hell yeah. Do we need to change how we think about sex, how we raise children when it comes to sex, how we perceive different sexualities? Absolutely yes. And so my answer is we do need a sexual revolution.
So we need to think about sex differently. We need to have better sex. We need to...
Women...
Oh, okay.
Like, I feel like men, you guys are okay, right? But I think we need a world where women's pleasure is centered. We don't have that right now. We needed to make it okay to talk about sex in public places. It shouldn't be this kind of secretive thing, right, that we can't speak about. That somehow if you speak about sex, you're a bad woman. As if we're not all here because of sex, right? We need to not criminalize particular types of sex. We need to ensure that people can love who they can love, that people who do sex as a profession are recognized as workers, and that they have rights, and they're protected. And so for me, we need a sexual revolution.
So we need a completely different mindset when it comes to sex in Africa, and particularly when it comes to women's sexual pleasure.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
So, do we need a sexual revolution? Oh no, what was the first one? The first one is, what does that mean?
Yes.
So, you know, I do women's work, right? So I look after an organization called Women in Leadership Advancement Network. So as the name implies, we're trying to be catalysts to advance women's leadership. And so I will not approach this conversation as if I do not have knowledge of what the reality is, all right? So the reality is we do need a sexual revolution. And a lot of what you've described, Nana, in terms of the shape and form that should take, I completely agree with. So we should prioritize women's pleasure and all that good stuff. But I know that there is, as much as that revolution and that freedom needs to happen, there are genuine barriers to that happening. And they're genuine, I almost feel like we're saying we need freedom in front of us, but then there's something holding us from getting that freedom. Do you see what I mean? So, and this, in summary, is societal construct, right? That has told us that we need to be a certain way, we need to behave a certain way, we need to do things a certain way. And so that is our reality, okay? But do we need a sexual revolution? Absolutely. I also have 3 young children. So I agree with you that the way that we talk to them about sex, the way that we present sex to them and allow them make choices should also be very different. But I've got twins, a boy and a girl, and I cannot also sit here and deny that they will not approach the world differently in terms of their experiences, right? And so my point is, in this sexual revolution, I think it is very important for us to take note of what holds women back from actually achieving that revolution in a way where it could cause more harm than not.
Okay, I think it makes sense to then continue. What I had asked you earlier was, assume you are the leader of the revolution and all of us here are gathered awaiting your orders, Ma. What do we do? Tell us what to do.
So if I was the leader of the revolution, I think the first thing I would want to do in this audience is I would want to understand what powers do we have in our midst, especially for the women? And I'll tell you what this means. What capital do we have? And I'll tell you why this is really important, because ahead of the revolution, we need a few things, right? We need resources. We need a space. We need safe spaces. We need technology. We need resources. So what I mean is, before the revolution, and I give that order, I must make sure that the people have what they need. And for me, women need to build more power. This is the song I'm singing. And for women to build power, it needs to be political and economic. Without political and economic power, unfortunately, the sexual revolution and those orders I cannot give.
What do you think about that?
I think, first of all, we need multiple leaders, right? If you think about all of the great African leaders and some of the initiatives they've tried to lead, you know, some of those initiatives have been torpedoed because it was one. We need many people doing work around sexual rights. And I feel like we actually have that now on the continent, right? So it's not about a single person. It's not about a single leader. It's about what we can each do individually. And I think it starts for me with how we re-educate young people, how we teach them to be comfortable with their bodies, how we teach them to own their own bodies, how we teach them the real names for their body parts, right? I mean, I bath with my daughter frequently. She's like, breasts. I'm like, yes. She's like, mommy's big tummy. I'm like, yes, mommy's big tummy. She needs to know all the parts of her body. She needs to feel comfortable in her body. You know, she needs to be able to come and tell me if somebody touches her inappropriately, right? She shouldn't feel any shame about her body. Sometimes people say to her, oh, you're a lady, don't say it like that. I'm like, no, she's not a lady. She's a little girl. I don't want to bring up my daughter to be a lady, right? I want her to be a girl and to be free and to grow up and to be a woman and to be free. You know, I'm being very intentional and saying to her, I'm a single mom, you know, and obviously in school, I guess she's told about daddy. She's like, who is daddy? I said, I am mommy and I am daddy. I want her to see that women can play the roles that daddies play. The families are different, because actually this is what we have on the African continent. You know, the idea, the Western idea of a nuclear family is not our reality. I didn't grow up in that kind of family, so I wanted to know that there are different types of families. And I think that's how it starts, you know.
Okay, so let's not go too far away from sex. You did some work with sex. You wrote this amazing book. How many people have read this book? The Sex Lives of African Women. Okay, maybe I should ask, how many people have not read this book? Okay, because if you haven't, then you should probably just leave now. Okay, no, it's an amazing book. You should get it downstairs. And a lot, there's been a great lot of reviews about the book, but it seems one common thread in almost every review I've read about this book is this sense of surprise. It seems like the reviewers were surprised that, one, someone was writing about African women having sex. It was an African woman doing that. And there were a lot of people who were voluntarily talking about, has that been your experience in talking about this book, that people are genuinely surprised that, oh wow, so they're doing it in that place?
I mean, the reason why I wanted to write the book is because I felt like, you know, there are many books out there about white women's sexuality. If you're thinking about more modern times, you can think of books like Three Women. You can think of sort of more formal research like the Sheer Height Report or Nancy Friday's and My Secret Garden. But we didn't really, I feel like we didn't really have many books like that told our stories and that were sort of global and everybody knew about them. And I knew from years of doing my blog, Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, that we had all sorts of stories to share about sexuality, that we had freaky stories, funny stories, crazy stories, and I just wanted to put those stories together in a book, you know, for people to know that, yeah, our experiences are diverse, our sexualities are diverse, you know, we are kinky, we are polyamorous, we are celibate, you know, we've experienced sexual trauma, we found ways to heal, and all those experiences are valid.
Okay, were you shocked by any of the stories you came across? Whether it was from your blogs, from the book, Have you come across any story that you thought, oh, wow?
I don't think I was shocked, but I think I unlearned things, right? I feel like there were some misconceptions that I myself had that I had to let go of. So I used to think women who had experienced female genital mutilation, for example, could never experience pleasure. And then I was interviewing a woman I called Waris in my book, and she was describing this incredible orgasm she had had, and in my mind, it's like, oh, how is this possible, right? So I feel like a lot of my own misconceptions I had to let go of. And then I also felt like some of the women I interviewed were pointing a mirror out to me and saying, hey, this is a blind spot, you know? So there's a woman in the book I named Elizabeth, who is a woman who uses a wheelchair. And she was talking about how she usually uses dating apps, and at some particular point in time, she has to figure out when is the right moment to tell this person I use a wheelchair. Because what will happen is some people may disappear, and some people will be like, oh, now I'm even more interested, you know? And I was just like, oh, how come I've never dated anybody with a disability, right? So it was more like I was also unlearning throughout the process of this book. And there were some people I'm like, I want their life. I mean, Helen Banda, after 10 years of being in a sort of straight marriage, she and her husband decided to open up their marriage. You know, one night he would stay at home with the kids. She goes out on her dates. You know, her lover comes to spend the night. And I'm like, yeah, this sounds like a marriage I can do, not the other type of marriages.
And speaking of marriage, Abosede, what do you think about this concept? How do you feel about marriage? You talk about social constructs being one of the major impediments to any kind of sexual revolution. What do you think about marriage as a social construct, and how it plays out with this sexual revolution?
So I feel like I'm the poster girl, to be honest, for your typical, I don't know, African family, right? But I think I do have layers of complexity that make it more exciting. So my father is Muslim and from a major tribe in Nigeria, and my mom is Christian, right? And she's from a different tribe in Nigeria. Now, what that means is, when I was growing up, I remember from the age of 14, my mom would say, if you get pregnant, bring the child. I would take care of the child, because my maternal grandma lived with me as well. So it's very typical, and my mom is Igbo, by the way, so I don't know, it might go against the Igbo culture, I don't know, but my mom used to tell, so we're 3 sisters, right? And we kind of followed each other, and she would always tell all of us this. Now, I don't know what that did to us, but it certainly didn't make us curious about wanting to go and have babies, right? So the thinking, though, is that you would grow up and get married. So typical, go to school, graduate, grow up, and get married. So that's what I mean by I'm like the poster girl, right? And then my mom got married early. So she was Igbo, got married at 18, actually. Yes, but she ended up then going to school because my dad was liberal, you know, has 2 masters, all that good stuff. But I say all of that to say that my mom got married at 18. I graduated from school in Nigeria, university at 20. Now in Nigeria, when you graduate from university, we have this thing called a service year, that NYSC, that's like your last chance to find husband. That's, to be honest, my brain was wired in that way. Now, I got married 10 years later. I know that doesn't mean anything to you, but that's 10 years of my mother buying other people's ashwebi and them not buying for her child, right? So I say all of that because at the end of the day, I was that girl who really desired to get married. So that's one piece. The second one was, at the age of 18, I grew up Muslim and then became Christian sometime at the age of 14. But I found God, like I found Jesus by myself. I always say by myself. Like I was in university, I used to go to a fellowship, all of that good stuff. Now, based on my own conviction and belief, I really believed in celibacy and purity. And I say this because at the age of 31, when I finally got married, trust me, nobody was handing out medals for being a virgin. Nobody was clapping for you. Boys were running away from you, and all of that. So I know this is very typical for society to say, do these things, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that at some point, I actually had a conviction. And I think that's what the sexual revolution is about, and what Nana has described. That we are in this, we then give people an opportunity to make choices, right? And not try to box them into certain formats, right? Which is the social construct, that you need to do this, you need to do that. Circumstances happen in life. Nobody wakes up, for example, and says, you know, your spouse might die. That makes you a single mother. And that wasn't something that you planned. And so I think that it's really important that we evolve as society to start to look at people beyond those boxes of, and I think why this is really important is, again, back to building power. If a woman who was a single mother was going to run for office, you know what I mean? Or somebody who was formerly a sex worker. And that's why society needs to evolve, right? Because the way that we put labels on these people really limits their ability to also fulfill their greatest potential. And also limits the, yes, and just limits what women can do. Because the point is, so if I'm a former sex worker and, made a lot of money, in short, I'll tell you a story of a girl that I met. And she's taking on this whole agenda of, women. So her mom was, raised in Edo State, if you know anything about Edo State, and found herself in Italy. And, she was born out of that, right? And she tells a powerful story of how she really empathizes with her mother because her mother didn't know better. Now, this woman has turned her life around. If she wants to run for office, imagine digging up that past. By the way, men don't have these challenges because regardless of your past, they somehow make it to powerful positions, right? So I know you asked me about something else, but the point is, this is the societal construct that will not allow this revolution to happen. And by the way, it's a mental model, and I think that all of us can change our minds.
And I think for me, the real revolution would be the sex worker can run for office.
Yes!
She doesn't have to be a former sex worker. Because she's a citizen. She's a member of the society. She can take up public space. Yes. She can be a leader. She doesn't have to say, oh, in the past I was this, but now I have seen the light. As long as that's her legitimate choice.
As long as that's her legitimate choice.
So I guess my question then, and part of my question is, when you look back on those 31 years, do you look back on them fondly? I mean, those years without sex.
He wants to cry
No. Do you?
He's like, oh my goodness.
No, I want to know. Do you look back on? How do you feel about that time? Yes.
No, I'll tell you how I feel about it. And I was joking about this, and actually, maybe I shouldn't talk about this, but, my daughter, I have a 7-year-old who's come back now and said she's met her life partner. It's funny, but it's also not funny. But should I tell you why I find it not funny? Because I just like the awareness. There's something about that awareness that I appreciate. You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it's not that I'm indulging it, but I'm actually curious about, how have you come to this conclusion and all of that. So what happened to me was, from the age of 16, I said I wanted to be president, and I always say that nobody around me laughed, because if they did, then maybe I would have changed my mind, but actually they didn't. And what that led to was I studied political science. So it led me to this journey where I was so focused. So if you think about those 31 years, to be honest, they were filled with a lot of, I traveled 30 states in Nigeria doing amazing work. I found an organization that said its mission was a world without poverty, and I was like, oh my God. They said their mission is to eradicate the inequities and the injustices that cause poverty. I'm like, oh my goodness. So can you see? So it's almost like, if I'm being honest, I was turned on by a mission. And my orgasms were coming from a totally different place.
Okay. No, I mean, it's a learning experience for everyone. There are missionary orgasms, I guess. Nana, what do you think? Okay, and then we're also talking about sex and maybe even implying a particular type of sex, even in the conversation, because I'm asking her, those 31 years you didn't have sex, I guess there's a mental picture that it
Physical.
had to be
Yes,
this.
with a human.
And do you see, what do you think about that in that sense? Because we know there's a whole range of things that could happen in terms of sexual pleasure and things like that. But what do you think about this mindset of almost a particular, when we talk about sex, there's a picture in the head and how that plays out? And how that plays out with what you said in the beginning, where we begin to center women's pleasure. How do we begin to change that kind of narrative?
Yeah, I feel like part of what we need to do is to have an expansive understanding of what sex is, have a broad understanding of what pleasure is. You know, in the past, I used to say I lost my virginity when I was 23. But when I was in school, I had sex with girls. I just did not think of it as sex. I did not think of it as anything, really. It was just, you know, something. And then it was only when I was 19 and I started reading, like, some theoretical books about feminism, I was like, wait, does this mean I was a lesbian? Am I a lesbian now? What does this mean? But the way I see sexuality is, sexuality is on a spectrum, you know? And, I mean, I'm not, like, a scientist or an expert, but I feel like a lot of women experience their sexuality on a spectrum. The challenge is society tells us this is what is legitimate. This is the only form of sex you can have. And so for a lot of people, you cannot even consider anything outside of what you've been told is acceptable, you know? And I think actually what we should really focus on, especially with younger people in mind, is solo sex, learning how to please yourself, learning your own body, figuring out what gives you pleasure. It's the safest form of sex, you know? For me, we should be preaching solo sex rather than, you know, the ABCs, which, like somebody says, leads to D, which is death.
Wait. So let's get that. What do you think? She's saying we should be preaching solo sex. So there's so many pictures going on in my head because I know I've read in I don't know these things. I've read about, you know. I've read about people who go to wash clothes and sit on the dryer and spend hours and hours on there. I've read about, you know, women taking motorcycles, okay, something like that, and, you know, just going for long drives and not coming home anytime soon. I've read about these things. Do they really happen?
Tell us, Nana.
Yeah, I think all sorts of things happen, right? I think what's important is people going on a journey to figure out what works for them. What works for one person may not work for another, right? For some people, celibacy is actually a way to tap into their sexuality because they grew up thinking that sex has to be for the man's pleasure. And they were always having sex, not because they wanted to, but because they wanted to please a man, right? So a woman I wrote about in my book, Shanita, she initially went on a vow of celibacy and started off saying she was going to do, I think it was 100 days, and then at the time I interviewed her, she had done over 1,000 days, right? But part of her practice at some point in time was also self-pleasure, and she was experiencing deeper and more pleasurable orgasms because she was now focused on herself as opposed to just trying to please a man, you know? So I think there are different ways in which people can access better knowledge about themselves, and I think the journey is different, and the fun thing is the journey. Like for me, like, you know, I was somebody who really grew up as a good girl, believe it or not. And I got married early. I think I got married early when I was 25. When that marriage ended, I entered my whole phase. It was brilliant, you know? I mean, that whole phase hasn't really ended. I don't think it will ever end, like whole for life. But for me, it's like, with everything else, we acknowledge the more times you do it, the better you become. But somehow with sex, we think practice makes perfect. You have to practice to figure out what you like and what you don't like.
I have to come back and then ask again about those 31 years. So was this a period of purity in the traditional sense, or was there solo play and other forms of sexuality?
So there was no solo play, I tell you that one. So when she was talking, another thing that came to my mind is, obviously we know the dictionary sapiosexual, right? I'm a typical sapiosexual. And I think that's important because, again, we're talking about the different forms of sexuality. So I am really fascinated by I am intellectually stimulated. And I'm just saying that because, so there was no solo play. Now, other forms of sexuality, like kissing and all of that, yes, there was. But oftentimes, it was really the mind. Yeah, what people would call, mind F. Right? Like, that was really what it was, right?
What people would call, you really whispered that, I didn't hear.
Mind fuck is what I heard.
Okay.
Thank you, Nana.
No, this is an important point, right?
Yeah.
Because we also need to remember asexuality
Okay.
is also a form of sexuality. Some people do not feel desire, right? They may want to be close to a partner. They may even have sex with a partner, but it's more because they want to, they recognize that as a need the partner has. And so when we talk about sexuality and being sex positive, it doesn't mean everybody should go around having sex. It depends. I admire the people who are sapiosexual. I wish I was. I'm all about the looks,
Okay. Okay. Sorry. I keep so.
Oh my goodness.
No. Like I said, it's a learning experience. It's a journey. Some of us have headed out on that journey because, yeah. Okay. So now, in terms of bringing us back to, so what would be the point of this revolution if it did happen? I mean, if we're talking about needing a revolution, it means that something's not working with where we are presently. And then following this revolution, there would be a number of deliverables, things that we would say, oh, there's improvement in this. So what would be the point of this revolution? For Abosede, when it's your turn, I would want to know, when we hand women power or hand them, and I'm intentionally saying hand them, but when we do all of that,
We're
and
taking
then,
it's not being handed to us.
and the sexual revolution happens, what's the picture? And same thing for you, Nana. If this sexual revolution happened over the course of this Ake festival, what would next week look like?
For me, the point of the revolution is freedom. It is freedom to be who we are. It is freedom to love who we want. It is freedom to explore, freedom to learn, freedom to unlearn. It means we will not have the state in our fucking business trying to tell us who we can have sex with, who we can marry, who we can hold hands with. We can be ourselves. We can be free.
So when women have the political and economic power, when you were asking that question, the picture that I had was the rural woman for some odd reason. And, like I said, because I do the work, right, I know the reality. So when you were asking the question, actually the picture I saw was a rural woman who, unfortunately, is not able to exert herself in the ways that we are describing, right? Who has so many hurdles to cross. And that is the reality. And in the context of Nigeria, for example, there are more than those of us who can attain this freedom. So I want to think about it in the context of not just ourselves, because we're privileged, right? We're educated, we can, make choices, we can have conversations. But with the rural women, a lot of them don't have economic power and mostly political power. And that's why they come to my mind. So what should happen, I think, is agency. So what I want to see next week when this revolution has happened is that woman has agency, right? The woman doesn't need she doesn't need permission. You see what I mean? Because right now what's happening is she needs permission for what she does, where she goes, how she spends money, where she gets the money from, right? Now, those are all barriers that even if you wanted to sneak out and have a little something, something, it just wouldn't happen. And that's the reality, right? Nana, do you want to say something to that?
Yes, I do. Because I feel like sometimes we have a particular view of the so-called rural woman. And I don't think the urban woman, i.e. you and I, are more free than the rural woman. I think there are
Fair
plenty
points.
of women that we think are free and they are not, you know? And sometimes, in some ways, I feel like those of us in urban areas, brought up in particular ways, are constrained by notions of respectability that women in rural areas do not have when it comes to sex. You know, they may be perceived as vulgar because they are actually being more open about their sexual desires and their wants. You know, and I don't want us to assume that women in rural communities are somehow more vulnerable and need saving. You know, I think we all need saving.
No, we all need saving, but I guess the reality is that the woman, so we all need saving. And I agree with you that the sexual revolution, the word is freedom. And I started by saying there are genuine constraints. So there are constraints for me as an urban woman. But I really would argue that there are more constraints, you know, especially sexually. Because even access to contraception, you know, like these are real issues that if we look at the data, it is actually skewed negatively in their favor. So I'm talking practically as well, right? So let's go to what that revolution would look like. Why I say they need agency is the moment you have agency, then it's almost like you're limitless in terms of your power and what can happen. And that is where choice comes from. Now, if I think about the reason I do the type of work that I do, I have been able to summarize it as I want as many people to have the freedom of choice. That is my why. And freedom of choice is not something that everybody, unfortunately, today has. For the sexual revolution to happen, we need more people to have freedom of choice than have today. And I think that's really what underpins that sexual revolution.
Okay. Okay. And I guess the next question, or the obvious question, is to what end, and then what happens with that. But I think that's something I would allow the audience to also get involved a little bit more with. We had a third panelist, but unfortunately things happen. Her flight got canceled. And for those of us that may be aware of Sekyiamah's work, a lot of her work focuses on beauty standards, on ideas of beauty, of body positivity and things like that. What are your thoughts with regards to that? And particularly with, you know, you said you're more turned on by looks, so obviously I know what I'm doing now. But then when it comes to beauty standards, what are your thoughts on that within the context of this sexual revolution?
I mean, the beauty standards are also what we have to unlearn, right? So that's why I gave the example of like asking myself, why have I never dated anybody who has a visible disability, right? Because unconsciously in my mind, what is also attractive is an able-bodied person, you know, and we have to unlearn that, right? We have to learn that all types of bodies are beautiful, that our own bodies are beautiful. You know I still have a preference for only having sex in the dark because then I'm not like worried about my stomach being jiggly. And I feel like it's the most unfeminist thing about myself, right? That I am still fat phobic towards myself. It's an ongoing journey. I don't think you just sort of become a feminist and then you just switch. I think it's because society gives you the opposite messages. You know, who does society say is attractive, right? So you constantly have to be pushing against what society says.
So, I mean, you know, it's back to this mental model, isn't it, right? The fact that what we grew up with as, you know, beautiful and attractive is tall, dark, and handsome. In our context, I think in a different context, that would be completely different as well. You know, and then you actually aspire to see that. And society, I don't know if you know this, but it's backed by data and evidence as well, that more attractive looking people are treated better and they're paid higher. This is all backed by data. It's reality. And if that's the case today, then you see why people aspire to that, right? So again, how does it relate to this? Excuse me. I think that it's that agency. So self-awareness, and you know, again, we're talking about the sexual revolution, but self-awareness is a huge part of this as well. And I'm sure that you agree with that, Nana. So it's it's okay to be the way that I am, right? And if that is how I choose to be, then this is how I am, right? And I will not be with someone, for example, who makes me feel less than myself. You know, I met this amazing Tanzanian classmate of mine, you know, and she taught me something that I've done ever since, which is, she says, Bosse, this is the body, because by the way, I've been trying to lose weight forever, like constantly. I don't know if there are any yo-yo people in the house, but like constantly, right? And she said, no, Bosse, this is the body you have today. And so be thankful to that body, because we know that the reason that we're on earth here is this body, right? So I feel like there's a journey that you take, and I feel like that's the agency, that's the self-awareness. And once you've gone through that journey and say, you know, so people have different styles. I love to see it now, right? So some people, and I'll use like an obvious one, like, you know, somebody like a T.Y. Bello. I love her style. Like, if she shows up in something different, I will be shocked, right? So that is a choice she has made to actually show up in that way. And I feel like as many as choose to show up in the different ways that they choose to show up, that should be the standard. So the standard should be your standard, right? And not any sort of standard that, whether it's media or anybody else is showcasing to you.
I think a concept I've heard of recently that I quite like is the concept of body neutrality, right? Because I think in recent years, the concept of body positivity has been pushed a lot, especially on social media. You have to love your body, you have to love your body. But in a sense, can we just feel neutral about our bodies? Can our bodies just exist?
But is that possible with the sexual revolution, though?
I think so.
You
Because
think
for me,
so?
that would be amazing. If we can feel neutral about our bodies.
So it's like, it's just bodies.
It's just a body. You know? I mean, it's just allowing us to do the
like
things that we
body.
need to do. Exactly.
Okay.
You know?
We'll get there.
Okay, so like I said, we're short one panelist, so we'll make you guys the third panelist by opening it up a little earlier than we had planned to for questions. So we'll take a few questions, get a few responses, continue the conversation, and then go back.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussions. But we are talking about Africa, particularly in terms of sexual revolution. I think there's something that we are not touching on. How are we going to navigate the religious landscape that we all know is quite important, especially in Nigeria? We are a country of very religious people. I say that with quotes, whether it's genuine or not, but outwardly that's who we are. You have mentioned things like loving who you want to love, being able to love whomever you want to love, things like having the freedom and the agency to do basically what would want to do sexually. But I think unless we address the issue of our religiosity, we are not going to go anywhere. Because those that, for one reason or the other, are invested in the religious industry will not sit back and allow this thing to happen. So how are you going to get around that?
Thank you. I'll take, there's someone right next to her. Yes.
Hello.
Three at a time, and then we'll come back.
Thank you very much. A great panel. I would like to say something touching on what Abosede said about agency. So last year in Ghana, where I'm from, and I think the year before, 100,000 girls between 10 to 15 were pregnant during COVID and the year before. 100,000. And to me, it says, and nobody was particularly outraged by this statistic. So 10 to 15-year-olds, this is not 15 to 18. These are 10 to 15. So what does it say about our society if it's all right for 10 to 15-year-old girls? And they were impregnated by teachers, by relatives they knew, by drivers and fishermen. we absolutely need a sexual revolution, because there was no choice. I can't imagine any 10 to 15-year-old taking part in any kind of choice. So that's something that's deeply disturbing about our society. The other thing is for you, Nana, I loved your book, we read it. What I felt what was missing there, and I don't know if it's just because of the people you interviewed coming from the blog, was older women. You didn't touch on older women at all and their sexuality, did you? Okay. In Ghana, many parts of Africa, women are widowed, 50, 60, so on. I talked to a lot of my aunties, and when I asked them, oh, aren't you going to get married again? Oh, no, absolutely not. And we're looking after our children. And I really wonder, I'm 60 now, and I'm like, really, seriously? I think about some of my aunties who were widowed at 50, and I'm wondering, did they really have a choice? Or this thing of, we want to look after our children, is a societal thing? So I'd love you to talk about those two.
Okay, one more. There's one. Don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to come to questions. One over there.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. Wonderful panel. My question is about decolonizing sexuality, because I think one of the big things we haven't touched on is the fact that a lot of the ideals we have, they came around through religious oppression and colonialism. But is there a movement where we're actually questioning these ideas we have of what a decent woman is? Where does it come from? So I can give examples. In Kenya, Kikuyu women, that's my tribe, they were always advised to have one child with someone who's not your husband. Then when your husband would have parties, his friends would come, and every night, and you'd be assigned, I guess that's an unfeminist part, you didn't get to pick, but you'd be assigned one of his friends to, enjoy yourself with after the party. There's tribes in Kenya where women married women.
Sorry, where in Kenya was that?
These are the Kikuyus. In Uganda, there's women who, they'll pull, excuse my French, but they'll pull on their cleats to make sure that there's a larger surface area for where you're experiencing pleasure. In Kenya, there's tribes where the Kambas, they teach women about sexual pleasure from the time they're teenagers. In Rwanda, there's, the holy waters, go Google it. But basically, there's been women being allowed to have sexual pleasure in African history, and that has been taken away. So even when we say these things are not African, we need to decolonize sexuality. So what are we doing about that? Yeah.
Hi, good evening. I would want to say, please, can we not focus too much on women and do the part where I think the problem we have is the fact that there's something we say in Nigeria, that women are raised to be mothers and wives. Men are not. We're just raised to have a child, and the mother sorts out everything. We don't really care. So I think as parents, as individuals, I think we should focus on raising good children. So when they get to power, whether male or female, they're concerned about the next person. So they want to know if their brother or sister is happy with who they are happy with, when they are happy and how they are happy. Not because I'm a straight heterosexual man and then my best friend is queer or whatever, LGBTQI, and I feel like, oh, it shouldn't be normal. I don't know if that makes any sense. So I feel like we should focus more on, we can't all have power. And like somebody said, even the men that are in power, God bless them. So we need to make sure that everybody that we're connected to is influential in the right way. So which comes back to our point of focus. And then secondly, I want to say that I have a little problem with this new thing that is coming out by binary. It's just a little problem I'm having in my, non-binary, that's the word. I know sexuality is progressing. It's progressing, sorry. So I am...
Sorry, so you have to, the question.
Okay, so I'm trying to know at what point where does it end?
Where does what end?
Like, so everybody would come out with a, how do I put it?
Okay, so let's do this with that question. I think it's a question, it's
no, the sexuality trend is coming to the point where
but
sexual
I feel like
orientation,
you're thinking out loud, so let's do this. We'll allow you explore the idea, and then we'll take the previous concept. So I think you're coming to terms with the revolution and all the things it brings forward. So it's an exciting experience for you. But I'm not sure that there's quite a question for our panelists to answer now until it's fully formed. So there are several questions. One is how do we keep these safe spaces for exploring sexuality, sex, pleasure, these fantastic ideas? How do we keep them inclusive? How do we get the straitjacket, intentional use of the word, these notions of what sex is, what sexuality is, what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable? How do we allow the spaces where we have these conversations be inclusive so that we don't move from one restrictive model to another restrictive model? And then the idea of power, don't you think that that may in itself become problematic if, and I think she also touched on it, if that is the ultimate requirement for a revolution to occur? Then there was a question about, is there a template? I mean, we know what doesn't work. We know what is currently not at play, but is there a template that we could maybe borrow? There was a question about how do I raise my daughter in such a way that she feels that sex is okay, sexuality is okay, but I am not necessarily asking you to go out and have sex. So it is okay, it's great, it's fantastic, but this is not, I'm not saying you have to have sex before you come back today. So how do we get that messaging right, where we're not being, you understand what I mean? It's not a PR program, but it's essentially, it's not, I don't want you to feel shame with what is normal. And then we're talking about women and having women in positions of power, and there's experiences of women in these positions of power that have done more damage than you know, some of the, I wish we had men on the panel, they would have, I don't know. But then how do we pick the right women, I guess, or what do you think about this notion of women being, and I think she summarized all these questions. So I'll allow you guys answer as many of the questions as you can as you sign off, because I've been warned that we're out of time.
So let me just start from how we raise our daughters. So I said two things today that sort of lends credence to that, which is one, my mom saying, go, you know, you can bring the child, right? So she wasn't sort of authorizing, but she was saying it is okay if you do make a mistake. You see what I'm saying? And like I said, nobody brought a child, okay? The second thing I said was, when I said my 7-year-old is saying she has found her life partner, that is exactly what makes me very sort of, I'm not clapping for her, but I'm actually like, what exactly is this, right? And that is the opportunity for conversation. So I think communication is a huge part of how we raise our daughters, you know, in addition to all the other things, because society will help you raise them as well, right? So the socialization process. The second thing I wanted to highlight is, when I talk about power, remember I also talked about agency, right? So not everybody will get into a position of power, but everyone can exercise leadership, which is what I think her point was, right? Now, the truth is, we cannot ignore who gets into power, is my point, right? Because it does impact on how many people can have agency, right? So I'll leave it there, but that's just the reality. And then I think the last thing that I wanted to touch on was, let me let Nana take the rest. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, I feel like it's the importance of creating safer spaces. First of all, I say safer because there's no space that's totally safe, where people can talk about the diversity of sexual expression, of sexualities is super important. And I agree that feminist and queer movements have made the most progress in that way, but there's even still more that has to be done. That's something I am personally committed to. I just came back from Kenya, where we organized a festival around sex and sexualities called Sexual Utopia. And our goal was to literally have people experience, what would it be like to live in a world where I feel free, you know? And like the kind of feedback we got at the end was people saying to us, I have never felt so safe before. I have never felt like I could speak up about my sexuality. I could be who I am here, right? For me, I'm interested in creating spaces and co-creating spaces like that and expanding those spaces, because sometimes the very nature of an event like that may be exclusive, right? Because maybe you're not in the country, you can't afford a ticket. But I think it's important that we work to expand those spaces as much as possible. It's why I use digital space, but that in of itself can be exclusive to a lot of people. I think different people have different philosophies that guide them. My philosophy is African feminism. That's the philosophy that guides me. If I wasn't an African feminist, I wouldn't do the work that I currently do around sex and sexualities.
So, thank you very much. Please, a round of applause to the panelists, and a round of applause to you for spending your time with us.